Thank you for being here. It's part of this York International Shakespeare Festival event. We're very pleased to welcome you. The festival is all about connections through Shakespeare of all different kinds, and particularly the concept of Shakespeare as a world figure, an international figure. And it's been exciting to hear everybody who's been speaking or presenting work or showing productions this week, just bringing this sense of Shakespeare as an identity within their own culture to us. So it's absolutely fascinating. We're going to hear today about an unsung treasure, a little known treasure. And I'm going to hand over to Lauren Jansen-Parkes to tell us about the Shakespeare Memorial Library.
Thank you very much, Philip. Hello. I'm going to try that again. Hello. Hello, that is a bit better. Hello, my name is Lauren Jansen-Parkes, and I am delighted to be here today to talk to you about Everything to Everybody project and the incredible collection, resource, piece of history and inspiration that is the Birmingham Shakespeare Memorial Library. And hello to everybody who is watching online. Thank you so much for joining us. And to everybody who hopefully will watch the recording further down the line. Right, so Everything to Everybody. Has anybody heard of the Everything to Everybody project? There are hands in the room. That is fantastic. And not just from Philip. That's marvellous. So for people who aren't aware, Everything to Everybody, or E2E, as I'll call it, is a National Lottery Heritage funded collaboration between the University of Birmingham and Birmingham City Council, running until December this year. And it's aiming to unlock the Shakespeare Memorial Library, re-examining it, restoring it, raising awareness of it, and crucially, reconnecting it to the vibrant city and the people to whom it belongs. And it's really an honour to be here at the York International Shakespeare Festival. It also feels very fitting. As Philip said, the festival really celebrates Shakespeare as an international writer in all his forms, both in his lifetime and today. And what I'm hoping to do today is really show you that this lies at the heart of the Shakespeare collection too. It's a collection that spans both time and the globe, please excuse the pun, with over 95 languages represented. And before I get going, I also want to say a big thank you to Philip Parr for inviting me here and making the session happen, and to Parabola Theatre Company, who've been a key partner for the Everything to Everybody project. I also want to say thank you to Saffron Vickers Walkling for making me feel so welcome on my arrival. So, I'm going to start by highlighting my role, my job title in this project. I am the Community Engagement and Volunteer Officer. And this means that I have the absolute pleasure of doing lots of the public-facing part of the project, raising awareness of the collection through talks like this, and working with over 30 partners across the Midlands, a huge range of organisations and community groups, to explore and engage with the collection and to use it to inform and inspire their own projects and creative work. It also means that I am responsible for encouraging people like yourselves, whether you're in the room or online, to really get involved with the project and collection, which I'll talk a bit about how to do that later. It also means that I am talking to you very much from this perspective. I am not currently an academic. I'm not a librarian. I'm very clear about that. So this is not an academic history or assessment of the collection. It's a personal take on it. It's highlights, it's an overview. If you're interested, however, in a more academic take, in a more in-depth collection, I really... Hello, is this going to work? We seem to have a little bit of a problem with the slideshow. Apologies, we've got a little technical hitch. Ah, brilliant, we've got it going. Marvellous, we're back on track. So if you are interested in an academic in-depth look at it, I really recommend going to the Everything to Everybody website, which is here up on the screen. And this hosts a brilliant range of resources, including articles, podcasts and blogs from academics, archivists, researchers, both from the UK and internationally, who are associated with the project, including one of our directors, Professor Ewan Fernie of the Shakespeare Institute, and our project librarian, Lucy Kamanova, who has worked with the collection closely for nearly 20 years. And when I quote people, facts and figures throughout this presentation, they've all been sourced from articles helpfully posted on this website for everybody to access. And all images you see are courtesy of Birmingham Archives and the Shakespeare collection. Not everything is labelled in detail, so if you do have if you want some more information about a particular thing you see, please have a chat to me afterwards or contact me and we can provide detailed call numbers so you can access it. Right. Instead, I am talking to you as one of the people for whom this collection was founded. And by that, I mean a relatively normal person, a working resident of Birmingham who wants to learn about Shakespeare, culture, and crucially, its global resonance. So, what am I going to talk to you about? Hurrah, it worked. So we're going to start with a very short history of the Shakespeare Memorial Library, how and why it was founded and the people involved. We're going to have a chat about what the library was and what it is today. And the bulk of it will be an overview of what it holds, with some key examples and hopefully kind of some exciting things for you to look at. I'm then going to talk to you about the Everything to Everybody project, our partners, the work we're doing, and what we hope to do by the time the project finishes this year. And if we have time, I'll finish by sharing some of my personal favourites from the collection, when I'm doing a community workshop with visiting groups, I call the weird stuff. And this essentially means talking to you enthusiastically about some quite random objects. But I'm hoping that might spark some ideas of your own about the kind of research and creative projects this collection could inspire for the future. And we should have some time for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions or ideas, please hold on to them. I should be right in thinking that you can ask questions online as well. So, marvellous. I'm going to start with the obvious question. Has anyone heard of the Shakespeare Memorial Library? I'm aware we've got students from different places. Anyone in Parabola doesn't count, I'm afraid, you've already worked with it. Got lots of students from different places. Has anybody heard of the Shakespeare Memorial Library? No, we've got one hand. That is one hand more than I was expecting, if I'm honest, because one of the key reasons for the Everything to Everybody project being developed by Professor Ewan Fernie and Tom Epps, head of Birmingham Libraries, was the realisation that despite being a world-class, internationally recognised collection for over 100 years, the Shakespeare Memorial Library had kind of been forgotten. And in fact, that inspired the name of a book that was published as part of this project by West Midlands History called Forgotten Treasures. So I'm going to ask a different question. Have any of you been to the Library of Birmingham as it opened in 2013? Marvellous, we've got a couple more hands. If you have been to the Library of Birmingham, you may have been right to the top of the building to the Shakespeare Room, and this is the Shakespeare Room. It's on floor 9 and it is absolutely beautiful. It was designed and built by John Henry Chamberlain to be the very best room in town. That's what he described it as. And also an art monument to the immortal poet. And stepping there is like stepping back in time. It stands at the top of the building and it's both a monument to Shakespeare and Birmingham's literary and craftsmanship heritage. And it's a huge tourist attraction. Between August and December in 2022, nearly 50,000 people made their way to the top of the building to have a look at it. And that was fantastic for E2E because we had a brilliant exhibition about Shakespeare and Bollywood in there at the time. This is also what a lot of people in Birmingham think is the Shakespeare Library. So when we say, have you heard of the Shakespeare Memorial Library? A lot of people go, oh yeah, I've been to the room at the top of the Library of Birmingham. And that isn't surprising. It was built in 1882 to house the collection, and there are books on the shelves. But whenever I take a group in there, I always say, I'll let you into a secret. This isn't the Shakespeare collection. And if they're under 18, they usually go, whoa, what? Like I've just told them groundbreaking secret. The books are there just to make it feel like it was a library, like it would have 100 years ago. Today, the Shakespeare collection is housed in the climate and light-controlled environment that all of Birmingham's archives are kept in, which we call the stacks. So if you go to the Library of Birmingham, it looks a bit like a wedding cake. The Shakespeare room is the gold circle at the top, the crowning glory of the building, and that gold bit round the middle is where all the stacks are kept, all of Birmingham's archives. It includes the Shakespeare collection, but also early and fine printing, Milton, Cervantes, so many different things, and that's just the literary heritage, let alone all the civic records. So when the architect designed it, they deliberately designed that section to be gold because they described it as the treasures of the city. So this is where the collection lives now, but where did it all start? So I'd like you to think back 150 to 200 years ago to Birmingham in the 19th century. It was growing rapidly. It suddenly became this huge industrial centre. It was known as the city of 1,000 trades and even the factory of the world, as small workshops turned into large factories, making everything from buttons to cutlery, nails, screws, guns, tools, jewellery and toys, to name but a few. It wasn't necessarily a place associated with literary heritage. You had Shakespeare in Stratford, but Birmingham is where we made stuff. In less than 100 years, the population grew from 15,000 people to 147,000 people in less than 100 years. And the city's infrastructure, housing, sanitation, education, simply couldn't adapt to the rapid changes. And at the same time, there was an incredible amount of wealth amassing in the city because of this industrialization. And so there was a growing movement calling for significant social and political reform and the need to radically improve conditions in the town and the quality of life enjoyed by its citizens. And one of the loudest and most influential voices was a nonconformist preacher called George Dawson. There are lots of photos that are used of George Dawson in Birmingham's history, and he's a very kind of old man. He looks like your stereotypical kind of old Victorian white man with a big beard. I really like using this stereotype because I feel you get a real sense of why people followed and listened to him. He seems like a very charismatic man. He was very well educated, and he inspired many of Birmingham's leading and wealthiest citizens to embrace what he called the civic gospel. He called on them to use their wealth and particularly their political influence. Many members of his congregation entered politics, and some even became mayors of the city, to use it to improve the city and particularly raise the aspirations of its people. For Dawson and his followers, improving the city didn't just mean improving sanitation and housing, introducing street lighting and building hospitals. It meant education and culture too. They started the Birmingham Education League, which later on became the national programme across the UK, the first time free education was offered to all citizens. And they also built libraries. And George Dawson is quoted as saying, "A city must have its parks as well as prisons, its art gallery as well as asylum, its books and its libraries as well as its baths and wash houses." And he said this at the opening of the Birmingham Free Public Library. And I think that really sums up what he felt the civic gospel should be. I do want to briefly acknowledge that the lives and legacies of many individuals involved, such as Joseph Chamberlain, and the wider histories of empire and how that wealth came to be are very, very complex. And I am keeping this talk very simple. There is a lot of research and a well-needed discussion linked to that, more than I'm able to cover here, but that has been part of the Everything to Everybody project, and I'm happy to chat more about that afterwards. Right, I mentioned libraries, we're finally here. So, George Dawson and his friends, the antiquarian Samuel Timmings, or Sam Timmings, which is how he signed his name in letters, which I think is really charming, Sam ... Timmings. They founded a group called Our Shakespeare Club, and this did what it said on the tin. It was a very popular group that met regularly to discuss Shakespeare, its quotes, its legacies, interpretations, and also have some fantastic dinners. The records of Our Shakespeare Club that are held by Birmingham Archives, I would reckon around 20% are just menus of fantastic meals they had, often with Shakespeare quote-inspired toasts. So when the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birthday approached, there was lots of nationwide discussion about how to mark this. How do we mark the national poet? Statues were raised. There was a statue built in Stratford, in London, galas were held. In Birmingham, they decided to build a library. And George Dawson wrote to a local newspaper saying, "I wanted to see founded in Birmingham a Shakespeare Library, which should contain, as far as practicable, every edition and every translation of Shakespeare, all the commentators, good, bad, and indifferent. In short, every book connected with the life or works of our great poet. I would add portraits of Shakespeare and all the pictures, etc., illustrative of his works. This collection should have a room devoted exclusively to it, a small endowment, and some trustees zealous for its preservation." I think the ambition of that is remarkable. We are going to collect every single thing to do with Shakespeare, and we're going to house it in Birmingham, and it's going to be something that lasts. And this document I have on the slides is actually the minutes from the meeting they decided. And I love this document because you can see, I feel it's history in action. The document is originally titled Proposed Memorial to Shakespeare, and at some point in that discussion, they scratched that out and changed it to a library. I also like the fact that people have corrected their names to make sure all their credits and initials are kept, because people are people and don't change. So yes, I think it's real history in action. That's something that Archives does beautifully. So the library was opened. It was founded in 1864 on the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth, and opened with its own dedicated room in the Birmingham Public Library in 1868. And from the start, it was for the city of Birmingham, and that remains true today. It's publicly owned, it's held by Birmingham City Council in trust, and apart from some obvious items, some very valuable, very rare, very fragile items, the collection remains accessible for anybody with an archives card today. So it's free to explore. And from the beginning, it was international in nature. Huge donations from European scholars, especially German Shakespeare scholars. Something I learned with this project is that Germany nominated Shakespeare as their national poet before England did, which I just think is brilliant. And items in Tamil and Hindi were there from the start. They were also thinking about accessibility. George Dawson is quoted as saying, "The time has come to give everything to everybody." And he was talking about high art, high culture, not specifically about Shakespeare, but about culture in general. And that's where the title of our project comes from. And so right from the beginning, they were thinking about different languages, but also how different people with different access needs would explore it. And obviously a Victorian interpretation of access is very different to ours today. But it meant that right from the start, there were editions in Braille, in Moon, and embossed, so that people with limited or no sight could still read Shakespeare, and they were able to take those out from the library as well. And that was a great joy to share with one of our partners, Sense Arts, who work with people with multiple and complex physical and learning disabilities. They were able to actually see items that people with similar conditions themselves were using 100, 150 years ago to enjoy Shakespeare. They collected books from personal collections. Dawson and Timmins both gave books, but they fundraised, bought books from booksellers, and librarians associated with the Shakespeare Library travelled internationally to collect works. So it's off to a great start. And then in 1879, disaster struck. Did anybody watch the opening ceremony for the Commonwealth Games that was held in Birmingham last year on the TV or anything? Okay, there was this incredible section. I have to talk about it because we're all very excited in the project. There was a section called Everything to Everybody that involved a huge building burning down and paper falling from the ceiling. The library burnt down, and it was a huge blow to the city and a huge blow to kind of what people had been building. And there are some incredible accounts of the fire in our collection. The mayor of Birmingham running in out of the burning building to try and rescue volumes off the shelves. And at that point, the collection had around 7,000 books and only 500 survived. So we don't necessarily know even today some of what was lost. And the remarkable thing about a collection just sold is that some of them still smell of smoke. So we've got an edition of Two Noble Kinsmen here from 1624. And if you see on the side, you can still see where the paper started to blacken from the fire. So the books I mentioned earlier, we have the Braille editions, obviously very expensive, very large. They were rescued. And if you hold them to your face, you can still smell the fire kind of lingering on the paper because they've been so well preserved. Thankfully, key items that we hold now, such as the Shakespeare's First Folio, have not been bought yet, which was a bit of a relief. And there was a huge outpouring of local and international support. So within 3 years, the room that I mentioned earlier was able to be purpose-built to house the new version of the collection. So the Shakespeare Library, people really rallied round, donated, fundraised. And so it reopened in 1882 with this room, this time purpose-built by J.H. Chamberlain. And everything that's in the room, all the engravings, all the flowers, and everything are inspired by Shakespeare's plays. And interesting fact, this room has moved house twice since it was built. As Birmingham public libraries have moved, this room has gone with it. It's literally flat-packed and resurrected. And now, obviously, it's the crowning glory of the Library of Birmingham since 2013. So this is where the collection lived originally. I've given you a figure of around 7,000 books before it burnt. It was rebuilt very rapidly. How many items 150 years later do you think the Shakespeare collection holds? I'll give you a little clue. The collection outgrew this room within 15 years. By 1900, they started to have to move books to house them in other areas. How many items? Does anybody want to take a guess? 400,000. Oh, I wish it was 400,000. I think it's the first time anybody said more than that we have. We actually have 100,000 items. Normally people guess around 10,000, but 100,000 items. Normally people go, oh, but now I think people are slightly disappointed that it's not quite as many. Depends how you count it. If we counted every single individual piece of paper, maybe. I love that. So it's over 100,000. The reason we say over 100,000 is that sometimes it can be slightly unknown when we open a box exactly what we're going to find and how we count that. And I'd like you to have a think about what you think is in it. So I'll take us back to George's ambition, which is every edition and every translation of Shakespeare, all the commentators, arts, portraits, illustrations. And I'd like you to just shout out some things, different kinds of items. So we've got books, but we've got other things. What kind of things do you think are in there? What do we think? Anybody take a guess? Shall I tell you? A relieved nod. There we go. So this is a rough breakdown of what we have in the collection. So that's 40,000 volumes, that's books on the shelves. The picture behind this list actually is just one shelf of Hamlets, which gives you an idea of how broad that is. So that's what I like to call the Hamlets picture. 17,000 production photographs, 2,000 music scores, which include operas, works inspired by Shakespeare, music used by Shakespeare's company at the time, but also kind of odes done at celebrations by quite famous composers. We've got hundreds of production posters, both UK and international, 15,000 performance programmes, UK and international again, 10,000 playbills. Does everybody know what a playbill is? There was a kind of nod and then a shake of the head. Do you want to explain? Do you want to? I'm not sure. I was thinking like it's kind of like a program. Yeah, it's that. It's a very early program. It's the piece of paper that you'd stick outside of a theatre to advertise what was going to happen, but it would also have a cast list, an indication of what was going to be performed, any relevant information, prices, things like that. So it's very early printing. We've got hundreds of illustrations by different artists, including Arthur Rackham. We've got hundreds of scrapbooks, so literally kind of pieces of paper stuck in books, folders, records, annotated scripts, prompt books, adaptations, radio plays, and countless other creative material, stories, works of art by Salvador Dali, Picasso, Jean Cocteau, newspaper cuttings, archival material of some great Shakespeareans, including Ellen Terry and Laurence Olivier, and the list goes on. So it's not just books. A lot of people think Shakespeare collection, lots of plays. It's much, much broader than that. And right from the start, as I said, it was global. So this collection spans nearly 500 years. We have printed material from Shakespeare was working as a writer and an actor, right up until things that have been added this year as part of the Everything to Everybody collection. And this is the real contradiction of the collection that'd be quite hard to explain, and something that Everything to Everybody is really trying to do, is that the story of the Shakespeare Library tells is not that of Shakespeare, in a strange way, it's not about the man or the content of the plays. And it's unique. That's what makes it distinct from the brilliant archives held at the Shakespeare Institute and the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. It's a real material record of how people, and when I say people, I mean actors, scholars, writers, everyday people, people who just wanted a trip down the pub and to see some theatre from all over the world for nearly half of a millennium have responded to, been inspired by, and remade Shakespeare and his works in their own image. It's a social and political history of the world told through the lens of Shakespeare and the power of theatre. And it's remarkable for that. So let's have a look at this list in some more detail and some actual things. So we'll start with the volumes. That's the bulk of the collection. That's the books. I mean, there are many early and rare editions, academic works, including hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of translations and adaptations. So I do not have time, obviously, to go through 100,000 items. So these are key highlights. So every time you see something, I want you to imagine that there's at least 10, 20, 100 other things like it on the shelf waiting to be discovered. So obviously, they've got the frontispiece of the first folio, and I'll come back to that in a moment. This, I think, might be the oldest thing in the collection. It is an edition of The Lamentable Tragedy of Locrine, that famous Shakespeare play. Can anybody spot the problem? Thank you, at the back. We now know that The Lamentable Tragedy of Locrine, eldest son of King Brutus, is not a Shakespeare play. But what it is a book printed at the time that Shakespeare was alive, 1595, claiming to be a Shakespeare play. So nothing changes. From even when he was still alive, people were publishing things in his name. And there is some academic argument to say that, well, things were collaborative at the time. He might have written some of it, but we know it's not counted among the great works. It wasn't included in any of the folios. But yes, so it's a fake Shakespeare play printed while Shakespeare was alive. We also have key books related to Birmingham. So this is known as the Baskerville Shakespeare. It was printed in 1768, and it's the first time the complete works of William Shakespeare were printed in Birmingham. It's called the Baskerville Shakespeare because it's printed in Baskerville type. And John Baskerville was a very, very well-known, renowned printer who lived in Birmingham during the 1700s. If any of you use kind of Word, Microsoft, you might know that Baskerville is still one of the fonts we use today. We have some people getting very, very excited about that who love types when they come to see the collection. So I like to highlight that. It wasn't printed by John Baskerville himself. It was done by a printer called Martin, but it is the first Birmingham Shakespeare works. We also have stunning private press editions, such as this from San Francisco in 1952, the Grabhorn Press. This is Macbeth. We also have King Lear, and the kind of the illustrations and kind of hand printed work is absolutely stunning. So we also have an insight into how theatre was made, stretching as far back kind of as 500 years. So this is a copybook from Birmingham's Theatre Royal, which stood in the middle of Birmingham from about the early 1700s right up into the 1960s. If you talk to particularly older residents in Birmingham today about their first experience in theatre, and especially Shakespeare, they talk about the Theatre Royal. They remember going as a child. Sadly, it no longer stands there. The pub that was attached to it, called the Shakespeare Tavern, because they were cashing in on Shakespeare at that time, still stands, which I think is quite amusing. But sadly the theatre doesn't. But this is a copybook. So directors weren't invented really until the late 19th century, early 1900s. Would you say that's right, Philip? Brilliant. You were looking a little bit, I was like, better check. And so when people were rehearsing, this is what they had to use. Each actor would be making their decisions, and it would be up to the stage manager or the company manager to record that. And depending on the point of history in which you're working, paper is expensive, paper is rare. So sometimes you'd only have your part, your lines, and the cues that went with it. So these copybooks are often the only record of a play as it was produced at that time. And this one dates from the mid-1800s, early 1800s, I think. It's Coriolanus. And so you can really see kind of like people's handwriting, making notes, making edits, adding details. I like the fact that before the curtain goes up is double underlined I think that indicates maybe something went wrong in a performance. And it's a real personal touch. It's kind of real people held this, real people used this to make theatre. And we still have a record of that today. So, and there are countless ones, including ones by very famous Shakespeare. Sarah Siddons, who was a very well-known, very reputable actress. We've got her own personal notes on her take on playing Desdemona for a performance in Birmingham, which is kept in the same cupboard that we keep the first folio to indicate how precious and rare that is. So, speaking of the first folio, this is really one of the jewels of the collection. So does everybody know what we mean when we say the first folio? Because it's quite a strange way to refer to a book. So the first folio is the first time that Shakespeare's works were printed as a single volume. Can anybody guess when that happened? It's an important year this year. How long ago did that take place? Can anybody guess? Yeah. 1623, brilliant, exact date. So it's his 400th birthday this year. So 400 years ago, it was extremely unusual to print plays. Literacy was very, very low generally. When people went to the theatre, they talked about hearing a play. They didn't go to see it, they didn't read it, they heard a play. It was a very different way of interpreting the world. And so, although we have some printed editions from when Shakespeare was alive, they're very, very tiny. They're what we call octavos or quartos, because you wouldn't waste paper on printing a play, essentially. And they were really only for the rich, the wealthy, if a play was particularly successful. There was only one other time that a playwright printed his plays as part of a body of work before Shakespeare's, and that was a playwright called Ben Jonson. He was very famous, he was very important, and from all accounts he knew it. And he was mocked mercilessly by other writers and poets for the audacity of saying, these are my works, and it includes plays. Plays were a disposable media. They weren't seen as this high culture that we see it today. And so when Hemmings and Condell, who had worked with Shakespeare and were personal friends, decided in 1623, which is 7 years after Shakespeare's death, to publish his works, it was a really bold statement. It was purely plays, there weren't any poetry in it, and they called it a works, and they printed it as a folio. And usually the folio format, big, big paper, only folded once, very expensive, very luxury item, was used for prayer books, for Bibles, for political works, for spiritual works, for histories. They were not used for plays. So it was a really bold statement to say, we want these kept. We think these are important. This is worth spending money. And it took them a year to print it. There's a fantastic book recently published by Dr. Chris Latoris about the people behind the making of the first folio. It's really accessible. It's really interesting. I recommend it. And so that's what cemented the first folio's reputation. Apologies. If they hadn't done that, it's estimated we would have lost around half of Shakespeare's works. We wouldn't have The Tempest. We wouldn't have Macbeth. We wouldn't have A Midsummer Night's Dreams. They didn't exist in any other form. Nobody had bothered to print them. They were all in manuscript form, copybooks, things like that. They would have just been lost to history. So it really, that's what set Shakespeare on the track to become the national poet, kind of globally renowned writer that he is today. And we have one. Thankfully, we bought it after the fire. Apparently, Timmins and Dawson were offered a copy of the first folio before the fire, and they thought it was too expensive, which I think is quite a nice, funny little detail. So they bought it to mark the reopening of the Shakespeare Library. And we now call this the People's Folio. And the reason we call it the People's Folio is it's the only one in the UK that was explicitly bought for public ownership as part of this vision for culture and education for all. Other folios have been donated to libraries and are accessible. This one was fundraised, negotiated, bought for the people of Birmingham. So, and also I think you might notice the stamp on there. The first folio is stamped as part of Birmingham Free Libraries, both as a practical thing to stop people stealing it and cutting bits out, but also it's a real mark that this belongs to everybody in Birmingham and the Midlands. It also has a little paw print in Henry VI Part 1, which is a subject of negotiation discussion in archivists in Birmingham, because some of us say that it is a paw print and others aren't so sure. Having had a cat run over important documents, I'm very certain that it is, which is a glimpse into its life before it came to Birmingham. So after it was bought, it didn't leave the library for over 100 years. It's been kept very carefully. It was part of the reference collection. You could access it, but it's kept in the library until last year, when we did a groundbreaking First Folio tour across communities of Birmingham to share and celebrate the First Folio as belonging to the population. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I've mentioned translations and adaptations. People have been thinking about how to make Shakespeare accessible to everybody for as long as Shakespeare has been kind of printed and held up as a national poet. So we have lots of adaptations and kind of retellings for children. I wanted to highlight the Tales from Shakespeare by Charles and Mary Lamb. We have countless editions of this through different formats, different artists of different generations have retold this story. So we've got kind of one of the original printings in 1899, and then this is one from 1941. And we have had people who visited the collection recognize that book and say, oh, this is how I first learned about Shakespeare at school. I also wanted to share one of my personal favourites, which I like to highlight as possibly the creepiest thing in the collection, which is The Children's Shakespeare by Edith Nisbet from 1895, where she decided the way to make Shakespeare accessible to children was to draw all the characters as very young children. So I just want to have a look at that. It's a little bit unsettling, isn't it? So I think it really shows that the Victorians in many ways are very similar to us, but also quite different. So yeah, I quite like looking at that and thinking, ooh, that's a little bit strange. We've got more modern retellings, such as manga retellings of the Shakespeare plays, as well as cassette recordings and video games even. So, translation. Can anybody remember how many languages we have in the Shakespeare Memorial Library? Here's a glimpse of some of them. I threw it out casually in my introduction. I was wondering if anybody remembered. We'll take a wild guess. Oh, very, very close. And if you'd said that 2 years ago, you'd have been bang on. So we occasionally find a new language or there's a new accession added. So we have 95 languages in the collection, and the project directors are really hoping we will get to 100 before the project finishes. We had our first Somali accession through an education session last year, where a schoolgirl was asking about kind of what languages you have, and we realised we don't have any Somali, so she actually translated a little bit of A Midsummer Night's Dream as part of a picture, so we could digitise it and add it. So these include many different editions of Shakespeare translated over the past 400 years, but also adaptations, production material, scrapbooks, posters, academic material, kind of lots and lots of different ways of looking at Shakespeare, including huge holdings, as I mentioned, from Germany, from France, and from Russia. This also presents us as a project team and Birmingham Archives with quite a challenge. Sadly, we do not speak 95 languages. And so part of the Everything to Everybody project has been inviting collaborations with researchers and organisations to explore these different items, to make and celebrate connections that have previously been unseen or overlooked. Some of these items haven't really been fully researched since they were added in the 1800s, which means that sometimes when we've got a researcher who speaks a particular language, for example, we had a young person as part of our summer school who speaks Mandarin, who was able to tell us a little bit about something we had in a collection. And likewise, I highly recommend Parabola's work called A Little Patch of Ground, where kind of researcher Alexander Sokowska did a deep dive into the Polish holdings in the collection and actually uncovered some errors and new discoveries, which are quite exciting. And then Parabola used that research to kind of weave a walk through Birmingham city centre, matching with oral histories of Birmingham's Polish community, which should be available online at some point this year. I mean, just recently, last week, a student from the University of Birmingham was able to comment on one of my favourite translations, which is this 1983 edition of Romeo and Juliet in Welsh. And apparently they've made massive edits to the script, like half the balcony scene is missing, and things like that. So kind of what I'm hoping that we'll discover why those decisions were made, whether it was an issue of translation, whether it was an issue of time, whether it was kind of how to best retell the story to be kind of Welsh. So It also contains nearly 100 South Asian translations and adaptations, many of which have been part of the collection since it was founded in 1864. So here we have on screen Macbeth in Punjabi, Comedy of Errors in Hindi, and King Lear in Marathi. And it's not just translations, as I've said. Here we have a Tales from Shakespeare in Hindi from the 1920s. So one of the key opportunities and challenges facing both the Everything to Everybody project, but also kind of archives more widely, is acknowledging and reckoning with the history of how these items came to be in the collection. This collection was founded at the height of the British Empire, and we cannot kind of escape that. Brilliant. There's a story that used to be told about the Shakespeare collection where, in the 1920s and 30s, British diplomats, wherever they went in the world, were told to send material back to Birmingham, which on the surface sounds like a very kind of, that's quite like Birmingham's very important. That's quite an exciting, sweet little story. But actually that contains a very complex history that needs to be discussed and unpacked, and we can't ignore that. So for us working with it today, it's a fantastic resource. It's a collection as diverse as the city of Birmingham itself, and truly a global collection, but it's also a challenging legacy. And so we've been trying to explore that as part of Everything to Everybody and ask, where are the gaps? For example, why is there no Somali material? Where are the voices that have been unnoticed or even suppressed? And how do we tell a more honest and inclusive history of the Birmingham Shakespeare Library? So for example, this book was donated in the 1950s. We don't know what its history was before it reached us, but it's not a huge leap of imagination to think that this could have been used in schools in India as part of the colonial project. And so two key partners we've been working with for this include Desi Blitz, the leading UK South Asian magazine online, and Burt's Associates, who have been working with young researchers of colour and schools in Birmingham to unpack this and try and uncover the stories that haven't been told. Speaking of material sent to Birmingham from all over the world, and to misquote Hamlet, it's not all words, words, words. As I mentioned, we have over 17,000 production photographs. And the earliest of these are from around 1899. It's literally just somebody wearing a very fancy costume, being like that, right up until kind of really the early 2000s. Basically, as soon as the internet started to become much more of a common day thing, it became very hard to keep all those records. So it's a kind of almost like a time capsule of 100 years of production material from Shakespeare. It's organised by play, which is both wonderful but also quite challenging if you're trying to find something from a particular area or in a particular time period. And they include professional, amateur and school productions. And like the volumes, like the rest of the collection, they really illustrate key moments of social and theatrical history. So for example, we have King Lear from the new National School of Drama in India in 1964. A previous item in the collection, kind of if you're looking chronologically, is a production by the British military in 1945 in New Delhi, just before partition. So together they tell an interesting story. We also have things like key landmark productions, such as Peter Brook's Midsummer Night's Dream. And we also have very familiar faces popping up throughout the collection. Lots of kind of grand Shakespearean actors, your Kenneth Branaghs, your Maggie Smiths, your Laurence Olivier, but also some other familiar faces. Can anybody work out who this is? If you're thinking school productions, look at the ears. So yes. It is. It's King Charles III, or Prince Charles, as he was in the 1960s, taking on the role of Macbeth at his boarding school in the 1960s. So we also have wider production material, again from all over the world, professional, community and school productions, and this includes posters, programmes, designs, from all over the world, really chronicling how Shakespeare has been interpreted, claimed and remade at different times and different cultures. And it's a fantastic insight into what Shakespeare has meant to different people at different times, not just by professionals. Again, here we have a beautiful poster. The Priory School for Girls, it was in Birmingham, in Edgbaston, literally 10 minutes from the Library of Birmingham. This is from the 1920s. It's been hand painted. So again, they chart key moments of history through what is happening on stage. And so we often show this to school groups and it gets a very strong reaction. So this is a page from a scrapbook collected by a librarian, which was literally material coming from Germany right from the late 1800s up until the 1960s. So this is from 1930s Berlin. Obviously, it has very, very strong iconography. It gets a very strong reaction from school children who often question why we keep it. And so it causes lots of really good conversations about the role of archives, why we keep records, how we use them, how we discuss them. So yeah, they're also just very fun to work with, especially for our volunteers who are doing an admirable job cataloguing a lot of this production material, especially when recognisable faces pop up, not just in the photographs. So this was discovered last week. It's a very, very young Hugh Grant, famous actor for works such as Paddington 2 and the Dungeons and Dragons movie, which I think is his greatest work, possibly in one of his first professional roles. So this production material are often kind of classed as works of art in their own right. For example, these posters from Poland in the 1970s, the Polish School of Design, absolutely stunning imagery, really, really different from what was happening in Britain at the time, a completely different way of communicating, exploring and advertising Shakespeare. And all these posters you can see in person, digitized reproductions. The originals are obviously still kept at Birmingham Archives. They're on at York Explore as part of the festival. I really highly recommend you see them in person. They are absolutely stunning. We also have stage designs, some by very famous artists. This was created by Salvador Dali in 1948. Can anybody guess which play this stage design is for? He was a surrealist, so if you don't get it, I won't blame you. Can anybody guess? Yes.
I know, but I only know because my retired colleague Julie gave me a copy for my birthday.
Oh. Okay, it is As You Like It. With elephants. There aren't any elephants in As You Like It, but they're a key part of this stage design. Allegedly, he was very inspired by some Italian gardens that he'd visited that had sculptures of Hannibal's elephants, so he decided that they should be a very key feature of this production. We also have some very, very early production materials. I mentioned playbills earlier, especially from the Theatre Royal in Birmingham. Some date back as far as the 1790s, and it's a real insight, again, not only to how theatre was made, but how people experienced it. I mean, this gives you an idea of the grandeur involved in some Shakespeare production. You've got 200 auxiliaries, a full chorus, the Battle of Agincourt, grand entry of King Henry on his white charger, things like that. It's really it's a huge spectacle of the day. There was nothing straightforward or basic about Shakespeare productions in the 1700s and 1800s. You also get an idea of the what everything involved. There is one playbill that I absolutely love, which advertises a production of Othello, followed by an entertainment by some dogs and monkeys. So it was a full night out. You'd go to the theatre, you'd have your Shakespeare play, but then in case it ended badly, you'd have a dance, you'd have a jig, you'd have some dogs and monkeys. Somebody might jump through a flaming beer barrel, and then you'd go to the pub. So nothing changes. Again, these playbills and production material really tell key moments in social and theatrical history. So here we have paired a playbill from the Theatre Royal from 1846 and an extract from a scrapbook that was being compiled in Manchester at the same time. And this is advertising a performance by an actor who was known as the African Roscius. And this was an actor called Ira Eldridge, and as far as we know, he was the first person of colour to play Othello on a UK stage. He was a phenomenally successful actor. Theatre manager, he managed the Coventry Belgrade for many years. He was an absolutely remarkable person. He came over from America, was working in the UK. I always find stunning about this playbill is that it doesn't contain his name. He is nicknamed the African Roscius, which is a Latin term for actor. So even though he is the star of the show, he's the attraction, his name isn't even used on the playbill. And there is a quote explaining in that little bit of text underneath the African Roscius, basically saying, because a black actor is playing this role, he's a remarkable person. It's the first time this has happened, and likely to be the only instance that this will ever happen. And so obviously the debates about who can and should play what roles are still raging today. But here we have it playing out instead in kind of on the playbills in theatre history over 150 years ago. So here we have the Forest collection, which is a scrapbook, which leads me nicely into the next section. So before I started this role, I had no idea how wonderful scrapbooks are for any kind of historical research. I've already mentioned them about 3 or 4 times, key moments where you get a glimpse into what was happening in the world for those people at that time through the lens of Shakespeare. So I will tell you now, if you keep a diary or a scrapbook, archivists and historians of the future will love you. Please do. And this collection is full of them. They're kept by librarians as part of a way of recording the wealth of information that's coming in. For example, the programme from Berlin, newspaper articles, cuttings, things like that, all stuck into big books so they're easy to find. But they're also kept by individuals and families. And you can really see how everyday people really engaged with Shakespeare. They were fascinated by it. They loved it in different ways, not just going to the theatre to watch it or making it, but just by memorabilia, articles, cartoons, illustrations, little drawings that they did. It's a kind of real material record of how Shakespeare has inspired people and encouraged people to be creative in so many different ways. And we really see his work through their lens, that the world they're living in. Can you hear me? There we go. The Forest family were a family living in the 1800s in Manchester. That is all we can find out. We had a young person who wanted to do a whole project on the Forest family and the scrapbooks, went to Manchester Archives. That's all we know. They lived in Manchester in the 1800s, but what we have is 75 volumes of Shakespeare scrapbooks that they created as a family over decades. There are at least 1 volume, usually 2 for each play, plus 1 for the sonnets. And that's their record, that's the legacy that they've left. And it's an absolutely stunning legacy. We have news of the day. For example, they've got pages and pages about Ira Aldridge as he went on his tour around Britain in their Othello scrapbook. I particularly love these ones because you can see that they've taken bits and pieces from different magazines to create their own artwork. And also this picture from The Tempest, it's the same illustration coloured in by 2 different boys on the same day. And they're dated and they've got their name, Harry Forrest and Albert Forrest, 11th of July, 1868. And I really feel that the colours and tones they've chosen show their different personalities. And they are long gone, but we've still got that glimpse into what they were thinking and feeling about The Tempest at that time. I mentioned diaries. A remarkable resource we also have is the Gordon Cross diaries. And this is the nitty-gritty of the Shakespeare collection. It's how people interpreted Shakespeare's plays every time they went to see them. This gentleman kept 25 volumes of diaries, just recording the Shakespeare plays he'd seen and what he thought of them. And he had a wealth of knowledge about Shakespeare. He'd often comment, oh, they cut Act 2, Scene 2 from Macbeth, but I think the production worked more strongly because of it. And he includes early productions from the Birmingham Rep, so the first time Shakespeare was performed using modern dress in the UK. I mean, the Germans and different European nations have been doing it for ages, but it was the first time in the UK we thought to put it in modern dress in 1925 with Hamlet. You've got the list of the players, and then you've got his personal thoughts about it. The most personal information is sometimes we get a comment about, oh, I went for a walk down the river after and it was lovely. But you feel like you know him because of how he enjoys Shakespeare and his thoughts and take on it. So the last item I will show you for this section is also a scrapbook. And I feel it brings together in one remarkable object so many different aspects of the collection. So this is a very valuable tome of Shakespeare. It's from 1725. It's by Alexander Pope. This is 1 page of a volume. And it's kind of one of the first times somebody had put together like a scholarly edited version of Shakespeare. This is the right version. I've corrected some spellings, I've done some edits, I've looked at all the different folios, and here is an edition by Alexander Pope. And so in its own right, it is an incredibly valuable volume. And this was donated to us in, I think, the 1920s or 30s. But I'd like you to look at this picture. And can you spot unusual? It was printed in 17. I'll give you a clue. They didn't have colour printing in 1725. Someone has coloured this book in. We also know that illustration was stuck on at some point. And sadly, I've not got any of the digitized pages with me, but the secret this book holds is that throughout, there are newspaper articles and clippings stuck throughout. The first page of this book, when you open it, is the bill of mortality from 1803 from an area of London. Somebody has used this literally as their scrapbook, as their diary. And when I first opened it, I was like, well, maybe they're to do with Shakespeare. Maybe it's like relevant items. No, quite often very random. There's a whole clipping about a sale of Egyptian furniture being very fashionable in Richard II. There's a funny story about someone falling out of a theatre box in Drury Lane and breaking their leg in Antony and Cleopatra. But somebody has used this day to day as a precious item, not because they're interested in Shakespeare and reading the plays, although we don't know that for certain, but because it's a beautiful object, it's a beautiful book that they clearly have a connection with and they wanted to keep things with. So it's a material record of someone engaging in Shakespeare in quite a surprising way in their day-to-day way. So I hope you can see why I get very excited about this collection. You've just had an insight into some of the objects and also how remarkable it is that people didn't seem to know about it. And this is where the Everything to Everybody project comes in and why I'm able to talk to you and infuse at you about these things today. So, as I said earlier, Everything to Everybody is a national lottery heritage funded project that seeks to raise awareness of this remarkable collection, re-examine it, restore it, and reconnect it with people of Birmingham and beyond. So it has many different strands in delivery, a crucial one being reaching out, like I am today, to students, researchers, theatre makers like yourself, to say, look, we've got all this exciting material, it's free to access, and there's so much potential, not only for academic research in so many different fields. You could write a whole thesis on the newspaper clippings in the Alexander Pope scrapbook, I think, but also for writers and theatre makers to find inspiration in what has gone before. Again, you can see some of what's already gone on our website, and I really encourage you. It's not only academic articles, it's blogs, it's creative writing, podcasts, things like that. But we have over 30 project partners, ranging from large institutions such as Birmingham Repertory Theatre and the RSC, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and Sense Arts, to libraries, schools and smaller grassroots and community organisations such as Friction Arts, the Jewellery Quarter Research Trust and Birmingham Centre for Arts Therapies. And so the key aim of these partnerships was to encourage people across Birmingham to rediscover the collection and support them to make their own responses to it, which could then be shared more widely. And we had many, many visits over the last 2 years by artists, by community groups, to see the collection and to do their own research. And so here we've got a young researcher and a lead of a community organisation having a look. I think they're actually looking at some of the scrapbooks that I've talked about there. So this project, however, started in January 2020. So we started and immediately went into lockdown, which meant that our initial wave of partnership work and delivery moved online. And I really recommend that you look on the YouTube channel because some of those responses were purely online. We've got beautiful films, collaborations with Birmingham Rep, with local schools, often performing Shakespeare in different languages and through different mediums. It's impossible to chronicle everything in just a few minutes, but a very short overview is 3 key strands of community delivery include exhibitions in the aforementioned Shakespeare Memorial Room. Some of these have had up to 40,000 visitors, and these are exhibitions curated by community partners, so include items from the collection that they've really responded to, but also their own materials. So here is one by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, where they looked at the scrapbooks, they looked at the children's drawings, the children's adaptations, and then worked with Birmingham schools to produce their own scrapbooks, but also 100 tiny little clay sculptures of Shakespeare characters and figures that they'd learnt about. It was like the Muppets had taken over the Shakespeare Memorial Library. It was brilliant. Other exhibitions have included an exploration of flowers and plants in Shakespeare through the material in the collection. Stan's Caff, a Birmingham-based theatre company, worked with school children to create their own Shakespeare photographs, so reimagining Shakespeare on the streets and in their houses. Desi Blitz, who I mentioned before, did a beautiful exhibition about the influence of Shakespeare on Bollywood, looking at the South Asian language items in the collection, and actually adding Bollywood scripts to the collection as part of their relationship with us. The current exhibition is by Jewellery Quarter Research Trust, which is about Birmingham's heroic age. So the people I've mentioned, George Dawson, Sam Timmings, doing a deep dive into their lives and the role they took in the city. So we also worked with the RSC on a major exhibition on the 3rd floor of the Library of Birmingham, telling this story of the collection. It's called Everything to Everybody, Your Shakespeare, Your Culture. And this was on during the Commonwealth Games, kind of highlighting an overview of the collection. We've also got what we've called neighbourhood productions, creative responses to the collection by arts and community organisations across the Midlands. And some I've mentioned already, for example, a little patch of ground, Parabola's walking audio performance. We've also had films made that I mentioned on YouTube, including Shakespeare's Coming Home, which stars Adrian Lester and Frank Skinner, being absolutely baffled that there is Shakespeare in Birmingham and performing Birmingham in the Birmingham accent, and the Birmingham's Rep community cast. We also have worked with Ex Cathedra, a very reputable company in Birmingham, to create new music inspired by the scores in the collection. They've worked in countless schools across Birmingham doing a project called Singing Playgrounds. We've also had a Punjabi bus made. They brought an artist over from Pakistan, and this is touring around in June schools and community places to share items from the collection, so translations of Shakespeare in different South Asian languages on a Punjabi bus. And 3 family days at the Library of Birmingham, including one of the biggest fun palaces in the UK, celebrating everything libraries and Shakespeare. If you don't know about the Fun Palace campaign, as soon as you leave this room, Google Fun Palaces. They are phenomenal. Gets everybody involved. And here you can see a selection of our fantastic volunteer team that have worked with us in different ways throughout the project. The third strand of community delivery is the groundbreaking tour of the aforementioned People's Folio. So before 23rd of April 2022, the first folio, the People's Folio, had never left the library. It's a very old book. It's 400 years old. It has to be kept in all sorts of climate and light controlled conditions. And we took it on a trip. We took it around 7 different stops, including libraries, museums, a community arts cafe, with people of all ages and backgrounds being able to see this remarkable volume on their home turf. And this had never been done before. Other organisations like the National Portrait Gallery have loaned kind of paintings and things like that. Taking archive material of such age and value had literally never been done before. It was truly groundbreaking. And a particular highlight was working with Sense Arts. Sorry, that's my little boy licking the first folio, which I like to include on any presentation to show that it really was among people could touch as much as they could in its secure case. And ask questions and spend time with it. Sense Arts work, as I said, with people with multiple and complex learning and physical disabilities, and they did some beautiful work reinterpreting the folio and other items in the collection to be experienced in new ways, feeling the sound of Shakespeare on your body, hearing it, touching it. And the responses to this have been fantastic, remarkable questions, really both the surprise that it's there, they're surprised that it's allowed to be there, but also that sense of this actually belongs to you. Not only Shakespeare in its its words, its beauty, its resonance, but also this physical object, this piece of cultural history belongs to you. We launched this year's tour last Sunday at Aston Hall and are headed out to 7 more stops, including Winson Green Prison in September, which is the first time a piece of archive material has ever gone into a prison setting. And we'll finish the tour with a huge project-wide celebration at Birmingham's Bullring on the 21st of October. As I mentioned before, we've also got education work, bringing schools into the library to see the collection for themselves. A lot of children not only have never been in archives, they've never been to the library, some of whom can see the library from their schools and their houses. And so we've encouraged them to not only see the collection, handle objects, but also continue that tradition of making Shakespeare in their own image. How would they set it? How would they interpret it? We also have a summer school for 18 to 24-year-olds interested in archives or heritage and potentially facing barriers to do so. You can find out more about that by asking me later on if you want to. All of this, as I've mentioned, is underpinned by our volunteering programme. We've got over 40 brilliant volunteers supporting exhibitions, family days, but also doing the key behind the scenes work, working with the digitisation specialist, Richard Olbert, to digitise materials so it can be used in presentations like this, but also go online. So people wherever they are in the world can start to access the Shakespeare collection more freely. When we talk about restoring the collection, this is what we mean. It's at the heart of this is to make it accessible in the 21st century. And so it's digitising the material, it's cataloguing the material. So by the end of the project, there will be a new searchable catalogue for people to access it, both in person at the library and online. So Dawson and Timmins envisioned a library that could enable everyone to access, celebrate and learn about Shakespeare within their particular view of what everybody meant. And to me, the collection today illustrates, within limits that we do have to acknowledge, that people have accessed, learned about and celebrated Shakespeare and crucially made it their own since the moment Shakespeare was first published, from far further across the globe and in more languages than even he could have imagined. So the E2E project seeks to raise awareness of this record, restore it and start to fill in those gaps to make it less a forgotten treasure and closer to the everything to everybody they had started to imagine. So if you want to learn more or get involved, please do so. There is a fantastic page on Birmingham Library's website that gives you a step-by-step how to actually get to the archives in Birmingham. It's free. And finally, please keep in touch with the project. We can share more information, we can have conversations. Since I'm in York, it felt very fitting that I had a quote from Henry VI, since so much of it happens in York. But yes, please do get in touch with me, with the project, to learn more. Thank you very much. I do have more weird stuff to show you if we have time, but I'm not sure how much time we have. But I wanted to also allow space for questions in the room and online.
Yes, so we're going to move on to questions. Yes. Lauren, that was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
I know a little bit about the library just from having been involved with it. I forget just what a wealth of material there is and what a treasure trove of possibility is still there to be found. For people in the room, Damien's going to run around with a microphone. Please use the microphone so that it goes out on the live stream. It's on. Damien is going to take it. And I'm going to pick up questions from the live stream and pass those on as well. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you. I just want to say an absolutely brilliant thank you to Lauren for coming and giving us a wonderful talk. And I'm going to give Damien this back in a minute. But I just wanted to say, before I have to nip out, that actually this has been just so brilliant for the blog work that you're going. I mean, every slide that came up, I was going, there's a blog post, there's a blog post. And I then saw that you have a wonderful blog for your project.
Yes,
so
we do.
When you're looking for inspiration, look at Lauren's project blog posts, and also just this whole idea that, you know, we think, what can we do when we've studied Shakespeare? And we could do this sort of thing. Think about this in terms of what careers lie out there, how you can engage with Shakespeare once you leave York St John. I'm going to hand over to Damien now, who is going to come and get questions from you.
Do we have any questions? Thank you. Yeah, I really encourage our not only blogs from academics and researchers, but also visiting students, theatre makers, things like that. Some of them are deep dives into very specific languages, but others are just kind of an overview. There's two ones that I really love. One is about fan fiction and feminism, using some of the retellings of Shakespeare that we have in the collection, written by young women in the 1800s. And another is kind of marginalised voices as well, looking for LGBTQ trans voices that are represented too. So it's a kind of very broad range. Hello, there's a question.
First of all, I feel very inspired to go just book now.
That is wonderful. Librarians and archivists of the future will really thank you if you do.
Yeah. So in terms of like accessing the scrapbooks from the library, is there like a spot on the website where those will be compiled, or is that we have to make a trip to the library?
Currently, you do have to make a trip to the Library of Birmingham. On the 4th floor, which is kind of where the archives are accessed, it's the heritage floor. There's an area called the Wolfson. You just go online, you make an appointment with through Eventbrite to go there. And there's a step-by-step you can click through to get an archives card that is completely free. And all you would need to do is take a form of ID. The list of what you can use is on there too. The archivists in Birmingham are very, very lovely and are really eager for people to kind of discover and use it. Much of this collection is already online. Catalogue is being filled in with more detail. But also on my previous slide, I had, oh, I can't go back. But if you contact the project, our librarian, Lucy Camanova, regularly has inquiries from people. So if you said, I'm interested in scrapbooks about this, she would be able to, if the details aren't, if the detailed records aren't there, on there yet, she would be able to help find them for you. But yeah, the scrapbooks are absolutely remarkable. So thank you. Please do make your own, as you said. So are there any more questions? Oh, brilliant.
With Birmingham being so culturally diverse as it is, how are you keeping like Shakespeare culturally relevant to like the changing communities of the city?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. So when this project was developed, it was very much with the kind of that in mind, that it was called Everything to Everybody, and that was the aim of the Shakespeare Library, but the collection as it was being interpreted didn't reflect the diversity of the city. And so kind of that's where the community partners really come in. It's a federated project. We work with people all over the city, and it's an active kind of question of, okay, we've seen this gap, can we work with somebody to help fill that in, which is why there's such a broad range of community partners. It's also about making people aware in terms of the collection. I mean, as you can see from this festival that's happening now, people from all cultures, all backgrounds, all languages are making Shakespeare and making it their own. And that has been happening for hundreds of years, which the Shakespeare collection shows, but it is about drawing that out. It's refocusing. If you tell the history of the Shakespeare collection, kind of where does the focus lie? A lot of the narratives kind of from the 1800s about it obviously don't talk about the fact there is so much from kind of India and kind of across kind of what we now call the Commonwealth. So it's about bringing those stories back in and asking those questions. And sometimes those are very difficult questions to ask, because everybody, kind of all the choices that have been made in that collection have been made at political time, and every choice you make about what is kept in a collection is by its nature political. And there's a lot of rethinking in archives today about how that works. So yeah, in terms of making Shakespeare relevant to Birmingham today, kind of the project doesn't really need to do that, because that is already happening. Our role is to kind of make sure that we're amplifying that and sharing it and facilitating that and saying, hey, you're doing this work. Did you know that was happening in India in the 1960s with these production materials? This is a kind of, you're part of a long tradition and reclaiming that heritage. So.
There's a question over here to report in, which is, what happens now with the collection? Is it still being collected?
Oh, very, very good question. So there's two answers to that. One is, yes, the collection will still be there. There is an accessions policy being updated and redeveloped with the Birmingham archivists. And kind of our librarian is taking a key role in that, in terms of what is added to the collection to make it relevant, to fill in those gaps, to kind of broaden it, to really speak to the city today. So yes, the collection will still be in Birmingham Archives and be able to be accessed and be held by the archives team. The project itself finishes at the end of this year, in December 2023. And so what we're doing at the moment is a lot of work thinking about legacy. How do we make sure the work that's happened doesn't just stop, doesn't get lost? And so part of that is conversations with the library and working closely with the archives team, but also our volunteers are currently forming their own Shakespeare Club. We're retitling it Your Shakespeare Club rather than Our Shakespeare Club, to try and be a bit more inclusive, to hopefully continue some of that digitisation, that kind of cataloguing, to try and continue making it more online. Obviously, even with 3 years, we can't digitise 100,000 items. Some of them are massive, massive volumes. And so it's kind of picking and choosing and making sure we have those relationships established with schools, with organisations, so that people keep accessing it and continuing it. So. But yeah, hopefully the Shakespeare collection will be there for another 150 years, but won't be forgotten again. So that's what we're trying to ensure with our legacy. So yeah. Are there any more questions? Are there any more online?
Nothing more online. And I think, unless I see hands waving in the room.
There was the question.
There's one at the back. Thank you, Damien.
Hello. I was born in Birmingham in 1940 and obviously went to secondary school in 1952. We had a wonderful English teacher who worshipped Shakespeare, and the whole of our class did when we had it for about a year. And I remember going right through till we left school, and the last English lesson that we had with her, she said, when you go out into the wide world, people will laugh at you, and they will also think you're not very intelligent because you have a Birmingham accent. And that was true then. I hope it's not true now. She said, just remember, and throw it back in their face, that Shakespeare had a Birmingham accent.
Yes.
And the thing that I bitterly regret is that she read 2 lines from one of the plays, and they only rhymed in a Birmingham accent.
Yes.
Do you happen to know what they were?
I wish I could say them off the top of my head. I can't. It might be Love and Prove. Love and Prove. I'd say my accent got beaten out of me at grammar school. I knew theatre, not literally. But yes, Shakespeare definitely had a Midlands accent, and there's been a lot of fantastic work done at places like Shakespeare's Globe with the kind of research that you're talking about, where actually the Birmingham accent is the closest thing we have to Elizabethan kind of accents today. And so there have been some original pronunciation productions done at Shakespeare's Globe. I think there have been done in other places as well. But yeah, 100%. Some of it only rhymes, some of it only kind of the rhythms of it. The closest thing other than Birmingham we have today is the American Midwest. I've worked with some American actors, and hearing the lines done in a kind of Midwest accent, it really sings in a way that it doesn't when we try and be all Shakespearean and posh like we think we have to in this country. So yeah, Adrian Lester is one of our project patrons. He kind of grew up in the Midlands. He spent a lot of time at Midlands Arts Centre with the youth theatre, and there's actually a video that you can access on our YouTube. Can I go back? Yes, I can. Hurrah. And it's called Shakespeare's Coming Home, and it's Adrian Lester at one point performs the to be or not to be speech in a Birmingham accent, and he's working with Frank Skinner, who doesn't have a Birmingham accent. He has a Black Country accent, and if you are from Birmingham, that distinction is important. Have I gone? No, I haven't gone too far. So yeah, it's all there, and that's part of the project, is actually saying everybody knows about Shakespeare's relationship with Stratford. Everyone knows about Shakespeare's relationship with London. Those are obvious, but actually there is a very strong Birmingham link as well, both through kind of accents and experience, but also through the heritage that has been built through the library. Can I get to the YouTube? Going back. So yeah, if you search for Everything to Everybody online, there we go. Our YouTube channel has a lot of videos which include school children and their beautiful accents, but also often speaking in their first languages. Casey Bailey, who was Birmingham's Poet Laureate, until recently produced a poem called Bodily Anguish in response to the Ira Aldridge playbill, and Ira Aldridge's story is recorded through the collection, and all of it is in Birmingham accents because they're beautiful. So, thank you.
Can I add a second?
Yeah, please do.
You say you've got all scrapbooks and things. Well, I just wonder if anybody else can remember, and it was early in the 50s, a production of Henry V, and it was Albert Finney when he was young, you know, quite wonderful. And I went to see that with my brother, and we were sat on the end of the row, and my brother gave me a nudge, and I thought, and all the soldiers before Harfleur came down from the back.
Oh my goodness.
And I don't think that had been done before. And with Henry at the front, you know, so we sort of going past, what would it be Albert Finney, you know, and I was quite young, this was a marvellous moment. And they all went up to the stage and they crouched down in the front below the stage level. And then he stood up and that's what it said, once more into the breach.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, that is just marvellous. And perhaps nobody else remembers that.
I mean,
do you have spoken memories like that?
We don't have, the closest thing we have to oral history, I think, is the scrapbooks and the diaries. We don't have audio recordings of people talking. Yeah. I think maybe there is another heritage project in that, but thank you for sharing that memory. It was kind of really vivid. I could really see it in my mind's eye. I would be stunned if there wasn't something in the collection about a production with Albert Finney in the 50s, because that was really the height of the photographs, the scrapbooking, the records, when the librarians were able to collect that material. So yeah, there will be something in the Henry V boxes, probably, about that. That will be. And
it was also that production that Charles Lawton went to see and picked out Albert Finney as going to be good.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you. What is our timing? We're done. Brilliant. Was there one more question from middle, or did I?
I'm just thinking in terms of students, we maybe need to think about an oral history project of performances we've seen. I just want to hand back to Philip basically to thank you for just this amazing talk you've given to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your time. I've really enjoyed it. So
it's been great to have you here to learn so much more about the library and the possibilities and the amazing thing that is the Everything to Everybody project, and how that's opening up a resource and exploring and thinking about it too, and thinking about the interesting and difficult questions as well as the straightforward ones. And I'm corrected, 95 languages, ties in beautifully with the fact that this is an international festival, and that the more we think of Shakespeare as a citizen of the world, a writer of the world, then the more we in our society are able to be open to the possibilities of the world. Shakespeare is a great way of accessing it. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for being here. Thank you to the people on the stream who are watching.